Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore a story that begins at a school gate, with a contract that could change Diep's life forever. If you enjoy this kind of emotional journey, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. Morning came quietly, the kind of quiet that makes you believe life is finally letting you rest. Outside the elementary school, parents adjusted collars and backpacks. The air smelled of jasmine tea, chalk, and warm bread from a nearby stall. Diep held Nie's hand. Nie was 4, maybe 5, small fingers warm, a backpack a little too big, eyes bright with the simple confidence of a child who still believes the world will keep its promises. She hummed, then looked up. Uncle James said he'll come today. He promised. Diep's chest tightened at the name. Yes, she said softly. He'll come. They were almost at the gate when a black car eased to the curb. No honk, no hurry. Just quiet authority. The door opened. Mr. Phat stepped out in a sharp suit, calm as polished glass. He walked toward Diep like the street belonged to him. Diep, he greeted. Good morning. Diep's stomach turned. Not here. Not in front of Nie. Mr. Phat, she replied, forcing her voice steady. Her body shifted slightly, an instinctive shield between him and the child. Mr. Phat's gaze dropped to Nie, a small, practiced smile. Such a lovely child. Nie whispered politely, Hello, Uncle. Mr. Phat placed a thick folder on the stone ledge beside the gate. A pen followed. Clean. Final. A few parents slowed, pretending not to notice. This is an offer, Mr. Phat said. Diep did not touch it. An offer for what? For peace, he answered, as if peace were something you could buy and deliver. For stability. For Nie's future. Nie's hand tightened around Diep's. The child didn't understand the words, but she felt the air change. What do you want me to do? Diep asked. Mr. Phat tapped the folder. Sign. Diep's voice stayed low. Not here. His smile held. Why not? It's a simple signature. Because you chose a school gate, Diep said. Because you want me to feel trapped. A familiar voice cut in. Steady. Deep. Deep. Jame arrived from the side street, moving fast but trying not to look like he had run. His eyes found Diep, then Nie, then the folder, then locked on Mr. Phat. Dad, Jame said, calm but tight. Mr. Phat's expression barely changed. You came quickly. Jame stepped between Diep and the folder, like a door quietly closing. Not here, he said. Not in front of children. Mr. Phat's smile cooled. Then where? In a courtroom on television? Don't pretend you're above drama, Jame. I'm above using a child, Jame replied. Mr. Phat looked at Nie again. I'm protecting her. Diep's anger rose. You're using her name as leverage. Nie tugged Jame's sleeve. Uncle! Jame crouched to her eye level, voice gentle. Little star, go inside first. I'll talk to your mommy, then I'll come find you. Okay? Nie blinked hard. Promise? Promise, Jame said, slow and sure. Nie walked through the gate, turning back twice as if she needed to make sure he was still there. When the gate closed, the street felt colder. Mr. Phat opened the folder just enough for Diep to see stamps, signatures, bold clauses. A clean exit, he said. You stop stirring conflict in my family. And in exchange? Diep asked. Quiet days, Mr. Phat replied. Scholarships, doors opening instead of slamming shut. Your child's future without complications. Jame's jaw tightened. Without Diep, he said. Mr. Phat didn't deny it. Without your chaos. Diep stared at the pen. She imagined signing, pressure lifting, peace returning. Then she imagined the night after when silence would feel like betrayal. She closed the folder gently and pushed it back. "No," Diep said. Mr. Phat studied her like she was a calculation. "Brave," he murmured, "or foolish. Sometimes they look the same." "Not when a child is watching," Diep answered. Mr. Phat gathered his folder with calm dignity. "We'll talk again." He drove away without haste, leaving behind the bruise of his presence. Diep exhaled shakily. Jame reached for her elbow, steady, not forceful. "Are you okay?" "I'm standing," Diep whispered, "but I'm scared. He chose the school gate on purpose." Jame's eyes darkened. "I know," he said. "And I'm done letting him choose where we bleed." They didn't go home right away. Jame led Diep to a quiet cafe nearby and spoke plainly. "He'll come back. So, we prepare. Facts, lawyers, and a safety plan for Nye." Diep nodded, fear still in her throat, but something steadier waking underneath. At noon, Diep picked Nye up from school. Nye ran to her, then looked around, whispering, "Where is Uncle Jame?" "Working," Diep said, kissing her forehead. "Blah. He loves you." Nye nodded, then launched into school stories as they walked home. But Diep's phone vibrated twice in her pocket. Unknown calls. She didn't answer, not in front of Nye. When they reached home, Diep saw a new bouquet at the door. Simple white flowers. No card. Diep's stomach sank. Gifts without names were never gifts. She carried the flowers inside, set them on the counter, and stared at them like they might bite. Nye sniffed. "Pretty." Diep forced a smile. "Yes, pretty." Then she noticed something else. A small paper slip tucked under the ribbon. Just one line. "You said no today. You can say yes tomorrow." Diep's knees went weak. Her fingers turned cold. She folded the paper quickly and slipped it into her pocket, then looked at Nye. The child was already drawing, humming, safe in her own small universe. Diep walked to the window and scanned the street. A motorbike passed. A delivery man. A neighbor watering plants. Ordinary life. But she felt it. Being watched isn't always about seeing someone. It's about feeling your own skin tighten, your breath shorten, your mind search for exits. Diep called Jame. He picked up on the first ring. "Diep?" Diep's voice shook. "He left flowers." Silence on the line. Then Jame's voice sharpened. "I'm coming." "No," Diep said quickly. "Nye is here. Don't bring panic into the house." Jame exhaled, fighting himself. "Then listen. Lock the door. Don't open anything. Don't throw the note away. Take photos of it." Diep did, hands trembling. "Good," Jame said. "I'll call someone I trust." "Police?" Diep asked. "Not a full report yet," Jame answered, "but a safety check. Quiet. Professional." Diep whispered, "He's turning my home into a cage." Jame's voice softened. "Then we make it a fortress." Night came slowly. After Nye fell asleep, the house turned quiet in the way homes do when a child finally rests. Diep sat by the bed for a long time, watching Nye's chest rise and fall. She tucked the blanket higher, like she could tuck the whole world out. Then the doorbell rang. Soft. Hesitant, Diep opened the door to Mrs. Huyen, Jame's mother. Elegant as always, but her eyes looked tired, as if she had been carrying a secret too long. "Diep," Mrs. Huyen said. "May I come in?" Inside, her gaze lingered on knees drawing on the table. Something flickered. Pain, guilt, tenderness. "I saw him today," she said quietly. "At the school." Diep didn't speak. She waited. Mrs. Huyen opened her handbag and pulled out a small USB drive. Her hand trembled. "I kept something," she confessed. Diep's heart sped up. What is it? Proof, Mrs. Huyen whispered. Documents, messages, pieces that show how far Mr. Phat has gone to control Jame. Diep's throat tightened. Why keep it? Because I told myself I was protecting the family, Mrs. Huyen said, voice cracking. But I was protecting his lies. Diep stared at the USB as if it were both hope and danger. Why give it to me now? Mrs. Huyen glanced toward the hallway where Nee slept. Because today I watched a child walk into a school gate while adults tried to crush her mother. Diep reached out. The USB felt light, but her palm went cold. A floorboard creaked behind them. James stood in the hallway. He had heard everything. He looked at his mother, not angry in the usual way, more like someone who had finally stopped swallowing pain. Mom, he said softly, how long have you been holding that? Mrs. Huyen closed her eyes. Too long. James stepped forward and placed the USB back into Diep's palm gently. This belongs to the truth, he said. Mrs. Huyen whispered. Jame? He is your father? James' voice stayed steady. And Diep is my choice. Then he added, quietly but clearly, Nai is my family. Mrs. Huyen's shoulders sank. I'm sorry, she said. I was afraid of what he'd do if I stood against him. Jame didn't soften. He did it anyway, he said. He just did it slowly. Diep clutched the USB. If this is proof, then we can finally stop him. Mrs. Huyen nodded, tears shining. But you must be careful, she warned. He has people. He listens. He doesn't forgive disobedience. James' eyes hardened. Then we don't move alone. He took out his phone and made one call. Short, urgent. Lieutenant Hong, he said. I need a quiet safety check tonight. No sirens, no uniforms outside. Please. Diep watched him, heart pounding. The moment felt like stepping onto a bridge you couldn't retreat from. When Jame ended the call, Diep asked, What's on the USB? Jame answered honestly, I don't know yet, but I know who it's against. Diep's phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. Don't open the USB alone. Diep's fingers went numb. She showed Jame the screen. For a second, neither of them breathed, because it meant only one thing. Someone knew. Someone was watching. Mrs. Huyen's face drained of color. He knows, she whispered. He knows I gave it. A sudden sound came from outside, metal scraping lightly like a gate being tested. Diep's heart jumped. Jame moved fast, silent, to the window. He pulled the curtain aside just a crack. A shadow near the fence. A hand. A phone screen flashing for a second like someone was taking a photo. James' voice dropped into something dangerous and controlled. They're here. Diep felt panic rise, sharp and hot. Nai! She stays asleep, James said quickly. No shouting. Mrs. Huyen covered her mouth, trembling. This is my fault. James shook his head once. No. This is his choice. Another scrape. Then a soft tap at the door. Too soft to be a neighbor. Diep's mind screamed. Her body stayed frozen. James spoke into his phone in a whisper. Lieutenant Hong, they're at the house now. Seconds felt like minutes. Then, controlled footsteps outside. A low voice. The sound of a walkie-talkie, quiet but firm. The scraping stopped. A car engine started in the distance, rushed, like someone fleeing before the light reached them. Jame exhaled slowly, but his eyes stayed alert. He didn't celebrate. He didn't relax. He knew better. A gentle knock followed. Different now. Official. Careful. Jame opened the door to two plainclothes officers. We're here, one said. Is everyone safe? Diep nodded, tears sliding down in silence. In the hallway, Nee stirred. A small voice, sleepy. Mommy? Diep rushed to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and held her close. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here." Nye's eyes opened halfway. "Uncle Jame?" "He's here too," Diep promised. Nye relaxed, forehead against Diep's shoulder, and fell back into sleep like she had handed her fear to the adults. Diep returned to the living room. Mrs. Huyen stood very still, staring at the USB as if it were a ticking clock. Jame took Diep's hand. "We don't open it tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, with Lieutenant Hong and a lawyer present. We do it clean. We do it safe." Diep nodded, voice barely there. "He won't stop." Jame's gaze was steady as stone. "Then we won't stop either." Outside, the street looked normal. Too normal, like a mask. But inside that house, something had changed. Diep wasn't alone. Mrs. Huyen had finally chosen a side, and Jame, quiet, determined, was no longer only defending love. He was preparing a fight. The story did not end that night. It only turned the page.
Trong tập này, Diệp rơi vào bước đường cùng khi công ty bị mua sạch đơn hàng, nợ nần và sát bờ phá sản. Ông Phat hẹn gặp, đưa 20.000 USD và một hợp đồng mua lại, xóa nợ còn dư tiền, nhưng đổi lại Diệp phải rời xa Jame. Diệp cắn răng từ chối vì cô hiểu nếu nhận tiền, tình yêu và lòng tự trọng sẽ mất. Đúng lúc lời ép buộc lên cao, ông Phat choáng váng ngã gục vì bệnh tim. Diệp không do dự, gọi xe và đưa ông vào bệnh viện kịp thời. Jame đến nơi vừa biết ơn vừa bối rối, sợ đây chỉ là cái bẫy thật. Trước cửa phòng cấp cứu, Diệp im lặng tay run, chỉ hỏi: "Nếu hôm nay tôi cứu bác có để chúng tôi yên không?"